Hi, it's Jared from Strong Roots Farm. Welcome back to the farm. Today we're going to be talking about, you guessed it from the thumbnail, finishing cattle. Well, if you're not aware, this is our third video, and so we've talked about the other two stages of the American beef market as an industry. We've talked about starting a cow-calf farm. Thumbnail looks something like this. We have another video. All these will be down in the description. Then we've talked about stage two, which is the stockers. So raising stocker cattle or feeder cattle. And then today we're going to talk about the final stage of finishing these cattle, getting them ready to become beef in freezers, finishing them out. Now, today's video is not going to tell you the best way. So we're going to give you the pros and cons of many different ways to do this, because there are many different ways. It's really arrogant of somebody, I feel, to say there is a right or wrong way to do this. And so I'm going to give you a multiple different variety of ways to do it and let you make that decision. What is going to be best for you? So we will talk about 100% grass finishing beef. How do you do that? That's what we do. We're going to talk to you about grain, different ways to do grain, and then 100% feedlot, which is kind of the American standard, how to feedlot grain in a safe manner. I'll talk to you about different varieties of that. Stick around. Hopefully we'll get something through this. As we get started, I'm going to talk about three specific kind of units of how to finish, and then know that there are many different ways in between these. By explaining the three, and then I'll give you some alternatives, you'll kind of understand what you can do in between these three realms. By realms, I mean different models or different strategies on how to finish beef. So let's get started first with the grass-fed. How do you grass-fed finish? Completely only finish on just grass. Zero grain, zero extra supplements. As we get into these, you're gonna find a lot of people want to know about cost. And I know this, and as talking to a lot of people, they all say, what is the cheapest way? What is the most expensive way? And there's pros and cons with each of these steps. Most people think that grass-fed is the cheapest because you're only eating pasture. So today, as we talk about this, I'm going to talk to you about the costs throughout each method, but it's not necessarily the cheapest by only feeding grass because it takes a lot longer. So that's the first thing with grass finishing is we've gotten fairly good at this, but it still takes us 16 months roughly from weaning. So the average date of birth or lifespan of a cow, calf, steer that is completely raised on grass. As a calf, she's dropped on grass, her own mom is only fed grass, we wean on grass, and then we completely leave her on grass the entire life. She is at least 24 months old, 2 years old. The average animal on our farm is somewhere between 26 and 30 months of age. We butcher. It takes that long to get them completely ready to be fat and finished to take to the butcher. Now, ultimately, we love the product, and I'm not going to talk about in this video of why health-wise. So most people recognize grass-fed beef is more nutrient dense. Grass-fed beef tends to be leaner. Grass-fed beef has a healthier fat to it. So it's got more omega-3s and more omega-6s. Grain-fed, depending on how you feed them, can have the same nutrient density, and they can have good fat levels compared to what some people say on YouTube or in some of these books that I've read. There are different manners to feed grain or some portions of grain where you can still have some omega-3 and omega-6s. Now, I have found it to be true by reading research studies. I've never completely fattened one on grain and sent my beef off to be tested. So I want that to be known and to be truthful up front. But I have read a lot of research studies that do show if an animal is completely on grain, locked in a barn, you can wash all of the omega-3s and omega-6s out of the animal. Now, what does that mean for you as far as health goes? It just means they have lower levels. And so if you need omega-3s or omega-6s, you're going to have to add those into your diet in another manner, whether that be avocados and fish and other foods, or taking a supplement. So your choice of which type of beef you want to provide to your customers or your family, that is up to you. And nutritionally, that's all I'm going to mention in this video. Let's get back to just how to raise them. What is the difference in raising them and what do you need to do to completely grass finish. Now, we said before that people think grass-fed is cheaper because they only eat the grass. You're not having to pay for extra grain. And that is true, but because of the time that it takes us longer than grain, which you'll find out in a minute here, if you pay yourself for labor, if you're really crunching the numbers, it's actually more expensive because this square of land could fatten out more if we were bringing in nutrients from grain or calories from grain. On this piece of land, which we paid for and we pay taxes on, property taxes to Uncle Sam, you could justify the cost of grain saying you can fatten more animals on less space, paying less money for land, less money for rent, whether it's leased or purchased land, and less money on taxes because you can put more animals on by bringing in those nutrients. Now, if you fully do out the cost, to me, it all depends on what you're paying yourself for labor. If you're not paying yourself for labor, you can pretty much say that grass can be cheaper to raise an animal. If that's your only goal, to raise for your own family, there's less exports of money out of your pocket into each animal, but there is more labor and more time. It just takes longer to get there, and you will produce less amount of head per acreage because of that. So to me, you have to weigh that out. To be fair, you have to weigh that out in the cost. I do not think grass-fed is cheaper. The one major pro of grass-fed is it's a growing market. And so there's a lot of people really starting to get interested in their health. This notion, and I do not believe it's a fad. I've had people from the other side tell me grass-fed beef is just a fad. There's been enough evidence to prove the beneficial factors of health that it's a growing desire. There are more people wanting grass-fed, and because of this, and because of stores like Whole Foods and Jungle Gyms and some higher end grocery stores and some health food, kind of people out there pushing grass-fed for health, you can get a higher price for grass-fed beef. But it's warranted because it takes so much longer. And I believe it is the hardest way that we're going to talk about today to 100% finish out grass-fed beef only on grass and do it well. High fat content, good, quality of beef, good size of eye around, all of those things. It takes more work, more labor, and more knowledge and discipline in my book. But if you do a good job, you can get a higher price for grass-fed beef, and it is a little easier to separate yourself in a market. So if you're in a rural market like we are, where everybody around us sells beef, it's easier to sell grass-fed beef to compete with other people because there's less people to compete with in this market. Because it's tougher, in my opinion. That's why people don't do it, because it's tougher to do. It takes more knowledge. Now, what is that? Now, I've said that twice now, so what am I talking about? Well, when we first got started in grass-fed beef, we were doing it mainly because I didn't want to compete with my family who was raising grain-fed beef. And what I would consider good, back then when I first got started, I thought, I'm going to be a good cattle farmer. I'm going to rate my success as being good or great if I can successfully just get them to the weight, just get them to the correct weight that they were fat enough on grass. What that takes to do is, I've learned over time, you just have to have the right mixtures of grass all the time and get better at pasture management, which means we can't do it on just fescue. They say that South Poles and some of these other breeds will grow fat on fescue, and as cows, that is true. You can keep a cow fat if you have good grass-fed genetics on grass. But as raising finished beef, you pretty much have to have a multi-diverse pasture. You need more legumes like clovers and alfalfas. The negative with clovers and alfalfas that I've heard from some people is bloat. They're worried about bloat in their cattle. I've had one case of bloat in 15 years, and it was treatable. I have found that if the cows have low stress and you have a good mineral program with good clean water, you don't typically have a trouble with bloat. Where I get trouble with bloat is when I bring calves from somebody else's farm They're not used to the high protein in our clovers, and we drop it on them early in the spring. That's the only time I've ever had bloat. So if your cows are raised on good grass, they're acclimated to good grass, that worry of bloat is not there for me if you have a good mineral program. Now, my rating of myself has changed over time because it didn't take us but 3 or 4 years to learn how to get animals fat. But the very first animal that we did, that we butchered, took us 36 months. She was 36 months old when we butchered her. And because of rules here in Ohio, that means you can't have any bone-in meat. It's not a problem. We don't cut that way typically anyways. But over time, my standards for myself have gotten higher. Now, what this means to us is that the average daily gain, we want to average out. And so when I first got started, and this will tell you a lot about how to finish on grass, we would have months of the season. We were weighing our cows about every 60 days, our steers. I keep saying cows, but you understand it's steers, heifers, ready for butcher, hopefully. And there were months where we were getting 3 to 3.5 pounds average daily gain, which is good. That's really where you want to be. If you fall below 2.5, it's not bad. It just takes so long. To consider yourself good, you need to stay above that 2.5 per day. So we would have those months where we were doing really good. And then we would have hot, dry summer days where we would fall down to 2. So that month of August in Ohio was pretty rough for us. It was hard to stay above 2 because our cows were laying in the shade. They weren't eating as much. Our grass, we were trying to leave it too tall. It was drying out. There wasn't as much nutrients in it. We weren't getting those spring rains, and we hadn't hit the fall cool season yet. And most of our warm season grasses just weren't as high in protein. So we were dipping down. And then it would happen again in the winter. When we ran out of good grass and we were feeding hay that we were buying, our weight gains per day were falling back down. In the winter, the very first few years, we were falling down to only 1 pound a gain per day, which some people says is pretty good on grass. But for me, I wasn't calling that good. Now, we're still not perfect. We are averaging for a year close to 3 pounds a day. We're somewhere in the 2.85 to 2.9 right now. And we've done very well. I'm happy with what we're doing, and it took a lot of years of experience to get there. And that is the negative with grass-fed beef. The way we do that is by keeping our grass shorter, knowing when to move fast, when to move slow, do our rotational grazing better, watching our grass production as far as management. Do we need to seed down more clover in the winter? Do we need to do certain things? And then when we're feeding hay, we want the right type of hay and the right mixture of hay, and the silage, the addition of silage through haylage by wrapping and letting it ferment has increased this as well. And we've seen growth from this. Now we're even stemming into some cover crops. Is this going to help us? So there's lots of things you can do to get better, but it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. And that is the major issue with grass finishing beef. Now the second stage, we're going to go all the way to the other end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum would be you can have your cows and calves on grass, but once you wean, like these two little ones, this white smoke one and this little black one up here, they were weaned about 3 months ago. Once they're weaned, you would then take them from mom. Typically people put them on grass and do what we would call bucket feeding them for a month or so and slowly give them more poundage of grain per day. And then at about the 2 to 3 month period away from mom, then you're putting them in a barn and they're on full grain. They have an unlimited grain feeder and unlimited hay. So you put round bale hay the rest of their life or silage into a ring or a feeder, and they have an unlimited feeder. Like you just put feed in there and they can get it whenever they want. That's the other end of the spectrum. The only thing that really changes in their life from the time that they're weaned until they're butchered is some people will change the protein percentage. So when they're young like this, they're going a little higher in that 12 to 14, or some people even up to 16, which I think is pretty high. They're putting them in a barn at that ratio. And usually the whole barn or the whole, whatever's feeding off that feeder is all in the same weight class. You don't really have a mixture of weights. So you'll have 10, 12, up to 50 in one barn on one major feeder. And that all they change is that protein percentage. And then they finish out in the between 10 to 12. So the last month of their life, you may bump it up a little bit, but they're on grain all the time. So what's the pros and cons of this? Well, the con is pretty simple. One, you have to have a decent sized barn and they're expensive. So I would not recommend not having them on concrete. Now, when we say on concrete, we don't mean their feet are directly on concrete here on our farm. We have concrete in our sheds, but it's covered by 6 inches of wood chips. Now, some farms have them on dirt, or feedlots have them on dirt, or they have them on rock, or they have them on concrete straight on there. And they end up with this liquid manure that they push off every few days or once a week. And they don't use that as well with bedding. They don't put as much carbon in. But it really doesn't matter what kind of bedding you're using, whether you're bedding them down and you're cleaning it out and piling it up with carbon, or whether you're putting a liquid into a moat of some sort. Those cows are in that barn all the time, and those barns are costly. With that, you also have to have some kind of a manure spreader, or if you're doing liquid, a pump apparatus that pumps and knifes it into the ground, or however they would get rid of this manure. They sometimes spray it out at certain times, which means you then need tillage equipment or wherever you're gonna put this manure at. Second thing with this is the grain is costly. Now, right now in 2025, our grain commodities are low, so it's not super expensive. The cows are high, the cattle are high, but the grain commodity is low, so it's not as bad to buy right now. But when grain commodities are high, you have a huge cost for feed. So most people combat this by raising their own grain, which then brings in more equipment. You have planters and combines and gravity wagons and trucks and big grain bins. You're now in a grain operation, and they're providing their own grain. And then they're just buying minerals. So the major negative to this type of finishing is the cost of the barn and the cost of the grain. This type of finishing also comes with the fact of, because they're always around their own manure, some people say it's disgusting, cows are always standing in their own manure. And I don't find that to be true. People who do this well, there are people that can do it well and keep their barns clean, but because they don't ever leave that area, there becomes a parasite buildup. And sometimes, I'm gonna try to be nice here, sometimes that can cause sicknesses. So typically, on average, which I think this is fair, feeding that manner has higher vet bills. Whether you're given hormones or you're given antibiotics or you're having the vet come out more often, that method has typically a higher vet bill. Vet bill, it could be really anything. You could be your own vet if you're educated and do most of this stuff without having really a licensed vet come out. But typically you would need a vet to get certain medications and certain drugs, vaccinations, those kind of things. But you can do most of that yourself. We have a very good vet in our area, and there are guys that do a lot of their own, what we would call doctoring. And the vet comes out once or twice a year and checks out their herd, and then he doesn't feel bad about, hey, when I call up, giving an antibiotic. Now, we don't do that, but there are people that do that, and it's safe and normal and okay for people to doctor their own animals. They get good enough at it, but in the beginning, you would need to have a vet come. Now, even though there's some negatives to this for us, there are lots of pros to this. One pro is that you don't need as much land. All of those calves are now in a barn. You can either buy in hay or make hay. You don't need as much fence. So you're baling hay, the hay's not gonna run away. The grass that's growing that you're turning into hay is not gonna run away, doesn't have to be fenced. You're buying in grain. Now it takes trucking and all the other things, but it doesn't run away, so you don't have to watch it. You do have to watch your grain bins for moisture, and you do have to make the feed or buy the feed in, but there's less labor there or less worry because you're not an animal husbandry now. You're maintaining less property, and that is a pro. All of this equipment is write off. You can write it all off. It's all an expense that can be written off, and it has a value. It has a large cost, but it also has a value. The other pro for this kind of method is just the simple fact of producing such a larger product. Because you don't need the land, and if you had a big barn, you could put 200-300 head in one barn if your barn was big enough, and I know guys that have barns that big. You can produce a lot more on less space with less manpower. So one guy doing 100% grass-fed, it's pretty hard to feed out 100 with one guy. But in a barn with grain, one guy can work and handle 100 head because we've traded manual labor for mechanized equipment in those methods. So there is some vast pros to this. The other thing about this, and we talked about it being a negative with the grass-fed, is it is much faster. So you can take a weaned calf and within 8 months have them ready to be butchered on grain. They have no problem evening out that growth and staying at 4 pounds a day growth. I know people that are consistent, hitting that 4 pounds a day average daily grain. The winter, the bad weather, the dry seasons does not affect them because everything is hauled in and they stay a steady growth the entire time. The pro with this is because it's grain, it's like baking a cake. It's a recipe. This much corn, this much soy, whatever your recipe would be to make your grain mixture, it's simply a recipe. It doesn't take as much education. And I'm not saying that these people aren't educated. It just doesn't take as much labor and education to be good at it. And it doesn't take as much management. The equipment does a lot of the management for you. So if you're a guy who has a small farm, and we're gonna call it 30 acres as a small farm, and you work a job, but you need to feed out 30, 40, 50 a year, it's gonna be very hard to do that on grass, but you can limit your labor by feeding them on grain, and you can hit that number on grain and do more per year because they fatten out so fast. So that is a pro for this method. It also produces a very fatty product. So people who want a big round eye with lots of marbling and an inch of back fat, you can accomplish this on 100% grain. But you can also accomplish this on a small scale. If you're a guy with 5 acres and you have a 20 by 20 barn and you only want to do 2 or 3, you can do this with grain, reduce your labor, get a big fatty product if that's what you want. Most of my friends say, take a 1 a day, take a fish oil, and eat a fatty steak. And if that's your motto, you can do it with 100% grain. Now next, we're gonna talk about what's between. So I said we're gonna talk about 3. We've talked about grass-fed on one side and complete grain feeding, feedlot style feeding on the other end. And in the middle here, we're gonna talk about what we're gonna call bucket feeding. And to me, bucket feeding is a good middle ground. It is where you have your calves out on pasture, but every day you're feeding grain. And so the grain is compensating for the lack of pasture management or just maybe the lack of quality of ground. Maybe your pasture isn't you managing it. It's just the quality of ground that you purchased or leased, and it takes time to build it up to become grass-fed, capable ground. So that middle ground is you have them on grass, maybe you're rotating them, maybe you only have 4 pastures and you keep them in a month in each one. You're reducing a little less vet because of that. They're out on grass. They can get away from flies and pestilence. But in order to get them higher daily gains and give them more protein where your grass may not have it, you then bucket feed, which means you carry buckets of feed literally out to the pasture using mobile feed troughs or a mobile trailer. Maybe there's hay out there as well, and you are bucket feeding these animals. Now, one of my favorite things with bucket feeding, and one huge pro for me, is essentially you have a automatic cattle call when you bucket feed. So if I was to bucket feed all of these calves, all of these, steers and heifers that are out here, and I was to bring them a bucket every day, it doesn't even have to be the same color. I'm telling you, they learn when you have a bucket in your hand, that means grain is coming. It's gonna be sweet, it's gonna be salty, it's gonna have molasses, and it's gonna have the protein that they need, and they are excited when you come with it. Now, why is this a pro? Well, if they happen to get out, you shake an empty bucket and they will come running. If you need to get them into a specific area to load them and you shake a bucket, whether you have feed or not, they will follow you into that area. If you need them in a small pen, put a feed trough in there, throw some feed in it, they will all come to a little circle pen that you just set up out in the middle of a field, and you can then load them from that. No horses, no dogs. They will come a running if you bucket feed. The other pro to this is the simple covering up of issues, right? You just tend to have less issues. You tend to need less management. You also can do this on a little bit less land. You can have 3 or 4 calves per acre on decent grass if you're bucket feeding them. Now, this isn't total grain. So this isn't grain in front of them all the time. You're not leaving this feeder full. You're giving them a certain amount of weight per head per day. And that changes. That's where a variable comes in to be between, where there's multiple different ways to do this, and the protein percentages can be very different. We'll talk about all this in a minute, but you're feeding a specific amount of feed, which adds to another pro from 100% grain feeding, is it's less grain, so there's less cost. So because we mentioned it, we'll go ahead and talk a little bit about that cost. So if you had cattle on 100% grain, they would eat about 5% of their body weight. So I'm told 3 to 5% is the typical average for body weight of an animal. So if you think about a 500-pound steer, they're gonna eat, 5 pounds per day is 1% if you bucket feed. Now, if you put them in a feedlot, they're gonna eat 15, sometimes 20 pounds of grain per day, which would be your 5% up and through there. So it's much more grain per day. Cost of grain around here, if you buy it bagged, not big box store. You go to a mill where they're grinding up soy and corn, you can buy a 50-pound bag for somewhere between $11 and $13 at 12 to 14% protein. So there's your 3 main methods. Now, one con that we didn't really talk a lot about the cons with bucket feeding, it has a little bit of cons of both the grass-fed and the grain-fed. So you got cost where grass-fed has none because you're buying grain, but you don't have as much cost as the other. You need some more land and more pasture, which grain-fed doesn't have, but you don't need as much as grass-fed. You do have good pastures. They'll produce more weight, which produces less grain. So you see what I'm saying? Pros and cons kind of come a little bit of both sides. And that's where these variables come in to make multiple different levels between the 2 ends that we talked about. So we only talked about bucket feeding, but there's another 100 ways in between that you can do this. For instance, I know guys that are very specific with their grain. They only feed 1% per day when they bucket feed. And this grain changes throughout the year depending on how their grass is changing. So one part of the year it may be at 12 or 14%, or perhaps for 2 or 3 months, they don't feed grain at all. They only feed grain during dry seasons and during the winter just to keep good average daily gains because their grass is really good. Other people will feed a really high protein percentage, like 20%, really high, but feed very little grain, and the grain is only making up for the protein they're not getting on their straight fescue pastures. Now, to me, a guy who can do that is highly intelligent, knows grass very well, probably as good as a 100% grass finisher, but he also has to know his grain and what grain is going to be. When you can look at a pasture and tell what your cattle are getting protein and sugar-wise, and then make up for it with grain, you got it going on. You're doing a great job and you're highly intelligent. But for the average guy doing this, we tend to just give them the grass that we have in front of them, and we're watching their daily gains to say, do we add more protein or not? We typically stick to that 12 to 14% grain, and we would put it out in buckets and give them sometimes 1%, sometimes 3%, depending on how our cows were looking, our cattle were looking, and how they're finishing. If grass is scarce, they're starting to look thin, we give more feed. If it's going good, you can give a little less. And that's usually how people regulate it versus only giving 1% and changing their mix. The other pro to doing it like that, any of these variations in between, is that you can reduce your hay costs. And the hay cost in grass-fed is our #1 cost. It's really, besides water, which is very minimal here, it's really our #1 cost because our equipment is less, because we need more ground, but we have the ground, we own the farm. And so that becomes our #1 cost, and you can reduce that cost by adding in a little grain. And there is a pendulum of grass cost hay baled hay costs a certain amount and produces a certain amount of protein, and then it becomes more costly to keep them fat than grain would. Grain would then be cheaper per daily gain at some point in time when the grass, either the hay is not good enough or you're feeding hay and pasture, and there becomes a point where a little bit of grain can just get you through if you're on one end of the spectrum, or your grain is really keeping your daily gains up where your hay is not doing it or your pastures are not doing it. So there's many different variables here, many different ways to do it, none of which are wrong, okay? And so I wanna be very clear about that. I'm not an anti-grain hater and trash talking people who wanna feed that way. That's not what we do on our farm. We've chosen to do grass because of our product and our market. We like this method. We think it's better because we do it, but I'm not saying that any other method is wrong. And so any way that you pick in between there, you're still getting it done. And for me, that's the most important part, that you're finishing an animal the right way. You're getting a good fatty product that produces a good, solid, healthy protein. And if you know where it comes from, and if you're the guy doing it, I applaud you. That's really what this is all about. Producing a healthy product, a quality product, a nice source of protein from our small farmland, no matter how big your farm is. That's what I appreciate, and I applaud you for doing that. Well, there you have it. That is finishing cattle. So I hope that helped you. I hope you saw how the spectrum is there. It's a broad spectrum, and you can do multiple different things. For some people, having multiple different choices just confuses them. But hopefully this video has helped you zero in really on what you want to do. I will tell you, the further you get towards grain-fed, 100% grain-fed, the higher your capital investment is going to be. There's just more equipment needed to do that method. And so if you have equipment, it's not going to be as hard for you to do that or as costly for you to do that. Whereas grass-fed is cheaper equipment-wise, capital investment-wise, but there is the fence and the property, which is a very large cost depending on where you live at. So if you have the land and you have the fence, that could be the cheapest method for you. It's just gonna take you a lot longer. Either way, you now have some options, and hopefully this video helped you with understanding how it can be done and how you can finish them. Now we've talked about all three of those methods. I showed you all of those videos. You can now watch all of them and see the different parts. There is nothing that says, and I've said this in the other videos, that you have to do it a certain way. You have to pick just one of these models. You can do multiple different things. But there you have it. I appreciate you watching. One little plug for an upcoming video. So we've talked about these methods and how to feed and do things. I have come about with a new way to feed animals or gain ground for free. And so it's not gonna be clickbait. When I say you can gain pasture ground or hay ground, you can get feed for free, I have found a way to do this, and honestly, I'm a little bit disturbed with myself that I hadn't thought of this prior. I've been doing this for quite a while, farming most of my life, farming cattle 15 years, and this idea has never come to me, and I'm gonna be making a specific video about how you can do this. And so if you're in an area of America, or pretty much any place, any country, where there's row crops being grown, so people lease land, they raise corn and soybeans and wheat and other row crops around us, I'm gonna show you a method that you can use to get hay ground for free if those guys are around you, and it will help them as well. So make sure you check out for that. It's gonna be coming up here in a few weeks. Gonna be putting that ground in, getting that ready for us to put pasture on. And so I'll get that video made. It will take me a while to make it, but make sure you check that out when it comes. So with that, you're gonna have to like and subscribe and do all the things, hit the bell, and you'll catch up with that. So I appreciate you watching. Until next time, have a good one.